The grandson, already on his way, felt the ground tremble. The albino lion, with a roar that made the dunes vibrate, did not pursue the man. Instead, with a contained and calculated fury, it shredded the villain's jeep's 4 tires, one by one, with the force of its claws and jaws. The vehicle, now useless, lay under the scorching sun. The grandson, trapped in his own private hell, was left on foot in the middle of the 50-degree desert, certain that nature, indeed, would take care of everything, but not in the way he expected. The roar of the albino lion, still echoing across the dunes, was a premonition, not a warning. For the grandson, immobilized by shock and fury, the sound was the soundtrack to his own personal hell. He watched the jeep, his only link to civilization, now a pile of useless metal slowly sinking into the hot sand. The tires, once robust, were torn into shapeless strips, as if a primordial force had decided to dismantle his arrogance. The smell of burning rubber mingled with the dry, scorching air, an aroma of condemnation. 50 degrees Celsius. The temperature was not just a number, it was an invisible wall, a furnace that enveloped every pore of his skin. Sweat poured in torrents but brought no relief, only the sticky sensation of being cooked alive. The sand beneath his feet felt like an incandescent plate, and the horizon danced with mirages that promised water but delivered only the illusion of hope. He ran to the jeep, his heart pounding in his chest, a mix of rage and despair. He kicked the front tire, what was left of it, feeling a sharp pain that was insignificant compared to the pain forming in his soul. "No! It can't be!" His voice was a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible in the vast silence of the desert. He tried to open the driver's door, but the metal was so hot it burned his fingers. He recoiled, cursing. The brutal and relentless reality began to settle in. He was on foot, in the middle of nowhere, without water, without communication. The irony was a bitter poison. He had left his grandmother to die, and now the desert seemed to have come back to claim him. His eyes swept the horizon, searching for any sign of life, any trace of a road. But there were only dunes and more dunes, undulating under the merciless sun. The sun, a flaming eye in the cloudless blue sky, seemed to mock his insignificance. He remembered the map, the distance to the nearest town. It was a journey of days, perhaps weeks, on foot, under those conditions. Impossible. Thirst was already beginning to scratch at his throat, a premonition of what was to come. Meanwhile, a few meters away, the blind grandmother, freed from the ropes that bound her to the dry trunk, felt the sun's heat on her wrinkled face. The albino lion, with the patience of an ancient guardian, brushed its soft muzzle against the old woman's hand. She could not see, but she felt the imposing presence, the warmth of the animal's body, its gentle breath. There was no fear, only a strange sense of peace and gratitude. The lion, with a slight nudge, guided her away from the trunk to a small shadow cast by a rock, a temporary refuge from the solar fury. Its golden eyes, which had witnessed the grandson's cruelty, now watched the man, a pathetic, shrunken figure, beside his destroyed jeep. The grandson, in turn, felt a shiver run down his spine. He did not see the lion, but he felt it. The sensation of being watched was palpable, an invisible weight on his shoulders. The desert, once a mere backdrop for his act of cruelty, had transformed into a stage, and he was the protagonist of a survival drama that had barely begun. Thirst tightened its grip, his head throbbed, and fear, a primal and overwhelming fear, began to erode his courage. He was alone, but not unaccompanied. The lion, the desert, and the shadow of his own sins were his new company, and the sun, merciless, continued to climb, promising an even longer and more torturous day. The sun, a relentless executioner, climbed to its zenith, transforming the desert into a living furnace. For the grandson, every minute was an eternity of torment. Thirst, once a scratch in his throat, was now a tightening, tearing claw. His lips were cracked, his tongue swollen, and saliva a forgotten luxury. He staggered back to the jeep, hope dying with each step in the scorching sand. The metal, still hot to the touch, seemed to mock his misery. He rummaged through the vehicle's interior, desperate for anything that might offer a drop of salvation. The toolbox was empty. The glove compartment contained only old papers and a crumpled pack of cigarettes. There was no water, no spare map, not even a pocket knife. The weather forecast on the radio, which he had arrogantly ignored, now seemed like a decree of his own death. 52 degrees. The air vibrated, distorting the landscape, and the mirages began to dance with cruel intensity. A turquoise-blue lake appeared on the horizon, its waters shimmering under the sun, but he knew it was an illusion, a visual torture. Sweat streamed into his eyes, blurring his vision, and his head throbbed with a searing pain. He tried to turn on his cell phone, but the screen remained dark. The battery, exhausted by the heat and perhaps by time, had died. The last link to the outside world was broken. A cry of frustration escaped his parched lips, a hoarse, pathetic sound that was lost in the silent vastness. He was truly alone. The perception of being watched, which had once been a shiver down his spine, now transformed into a growing paranoia. He turned his head abruptly, expecting to see the albino lion, but there was nothing beyond the undulating dunes and the endless sky. Yet the sensation persisted, an invisible weight, a presence that judged him with every movement, every gasping breath. It was as if the desert itself had eyes, and he was the sole spectacle. The grandmother, on the other hand, felt the peace the grandson had lost. The albino lion, with its white fur almost luminescent under the sun, had lain down near her, offering extra shade and comforting warmth. She did not see its golden eyes, but she felt its attention, its protection. Her wrinkled fingers brushed the animal's soft fur, and a faint but genuine smile appeared on her lips. There was no anger in her heart, only a serene resignation and a deep gratitude for that majestic creature. The lion, in response, let out a low purr, a sound that vibrated through the sand and calmed the old woman's soul. She remembered the request for money, the illness that consumed her, the need for medicine. She remembered the coldness in her grandson's eyes, the way he dragged her to the jeep, the cruelty in his words. But, strangely, the pain of betrayal seemed distant, muffled by the lion's presence and the vastness of the desert that now embraced her. Life, she thought, had its own ways, its own forms of justice, and the lion, this unexpected guardian, was the personification of that justice. Meanwhile, the grandson tried to walk, one step, then another, in the sand that seemed to swallow his feet. With each advance, his body protested. His leg muscles burned, his head spun, and his vision blurred. He looked at the horizon, where the mirage of the lake now transformed into a distant city with tall buildings and swaying palm trees. It was so real, so inviting, that for a moment he almost believed it. But then reality hit him again, a punch to the gut. It was just the desert, mocking him. He fell to his knees, the sand burning his palms. Exhaustion was total, his body refused to obey. Fear, once a premonition, was now a certainty. He would not survive. The image of his grandmother, tied to the trunk, returned to his mind. A pang of guilt struck him, but it was quickly replaced by anger. Anger at the lion, anger at the desert, anger at himself for being so foolish. The sun continued its inexorable march, and the shadows shortened, indicating the peak of the day. The temperature seemed to rise with each passing moment, and the air was so dry it felt like it was sucking the moisture from his lungs. He tried to scream again, but his voice was only a hoarse whisper, a lament that no one would hear. The desert was a silent tomb, and he was about to join it. The grandmother, under the shade of the rock and the lion, felt the hot wind on her face, but not the oppressive heat. She knew the grandson was there, somewhere suffering. She did not wish him ill, but she understood that the consequences of his actions were inevitable. The lion, with a slow and majestic movement, raised its head, its golden eyes fixed on the grandson's shrunken figure. It was a look of judgment, of an ancestral wisdom that saw beyond the surface, comprehending the complexity of human nature and the relentless balance of desert justice. The grandson, unknowingly, was being watched by his judge and executioner, and the day, still far from over, promised a cruel verdict. The grandson's throat was raw, every swallow a torment. His tongue, swollen and rough, scratched his palate. He tried to stand, but his legs, like jelly stalks, gave way. He fell face down in the scorching sand, his face inches from the incandescent grains. The smell of burnt metal from the jeep mingled with the aroma of his own sweaty, dirty skin, a nauseating cocktail that churned his empty stomach. His vision, already blurred, began to darken at the edges, like an old photograph fading. He closed his eyes, seeking temporary relief from the blinding light, but the mirages continued to dance in his mind. Now, they were not just cities or lakes. They were shadowy figures, distorted faces that seemed to writhe in the darkness behind his eyelids. Paranoia intensified. He felt he was not just being watched, but hunted. The lion's roar, which had once been a distant sound, now seemed to echo inside his own head, a drum beating to the rhythm of his racing heart, announcing a hunt he had already lost. With superhuman effort, he rolled onto his back, his eyes fixed on the cloudless blue sky. The sun, a white and relentless disk, seemed to spin, and the whole world spun with it. Disorientation was almost total. He stretched out a trembling hand, as if he could grasp the sun and pull it down to end this torment. But his fingers only scratched the thin air, and powerlessness consumed him. The grandmother, feeling the change in the sun's intensity, knew that the zenith had been reached, and the heat now was a palpable force. The lion, perceiving the old woman's fragility, moved slightly, adjusting its position to maximize the shade it offered. A deep, vibrating purr escaped its chest, a sound that for the grandmother was like a soft melody, a balm for her soul. She brought her hand to the lion's soft fur, feeling the contained strength beneath the surface, the warm, steady breath. "You are my angel, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice weak but laden with deep emotion. "My unexpected guardian." The lion responded with a slight nudge of its head against her hand, a gesture of recognition and affection. Its golden eyes, however, did not leave the grandson's figure. It observed the man's agony with an impassivity that only nature can possess. There was no hatred, only the cold observation of a cycle completing itself. The desert, in its ancient wisdom, did not distinguish between good and evil, only between strength and weakness, survival and extinction. And the grandson at that moment was the personification of weakness, a fragile link about to break. The grandson's thirst had evolved into excruciating physical pain. His muscles began to spasm uncontrollably, contracting in painful cramps. He tried to crawl back to the jeep, the only thing that represented any form of shelter or hope, however futile. Every inch was a battle against the sand that seemed to swallow him, against the body that refused to obey. Sand got into his eyes, into his mouth, scratching his already raw throat. He could barely see, his vision blurred by sweat and dry tears, which now formed salty crusts on his face. Suddenly he stopped. A sound that was not the lion's roar in his head, nor the hum of the heat. It was a dragging, a soft rustle in the sand, like something heavy moving slowly. He turned his head with difficulty, eyes half closed, trying to focus. Nothing. Only the undulating dunes, the air vibrating in waves of heat, but the sound seemed to come from behind the jeep, where the shadow was denser and more inviting. Fear, once a premonition, was now a chilling terror spreading through his veins, despite the scorching heat that enveloped him. He forced himself to rise slightly, propping himself on his elbows. His head spun dizzily, and a wave of nausea hit him, making him gasp. But he needed to see, needed to know. Was it the lion? Was it coming for him? The image of sharp claws and ivory-white teeth filled his mind, overlaying the other hallucinations. He had mocked nature, profaned life, and now nature was coming to collect its debt, personified in that majestic predator. With one last desperate effort, he dragged himself to the side of the jeep, using the hot metal for support to stand. His eyes swept the area, looking for any movement. And then he saw, not the albino lion directly, but a shadow, an immense white shadow moving slowly behind the dunes in the opposite direction from his grandmother. It was the lion, yes, but it was moving away, seeming to patrol, keeping a distance but still present, a constant and threatening presence. The sight, for a brief moment, brought paradoxical relief. The lion was not coming for him, yet, but the feeling of being prey, of being watched, did not diminish. On the contrary, it intensified. The lion did not need to attack him. The desert would do the work. The animal was merely the guardian, the silent executor of a sentence already pronounced, a herald of slowly approaching death. He fell again, his body exhausted, his mind in tatters, his mouth dry and cracked. The sun began to set slowly, but the temperature seemed not to yield, remaining at an unbearable level. Every ray was an arrow of fire, every breeze the breath of a furnace. Hope, if any remained, had completely vanished. He was in the middle of nowhere, without water, without strength, and with the certainty that the night would bring new horrors, new threats, perhaps more real than the hallucinations. The albino lion, a white phantom on the horizon, was the last thing he saw before darkness began to swallow the edges of his vision, not the darkness of night, but the darkness of imminent collapse. The desert, relentless, awaited its final verdict. The darkness was not the relief he expected. It was not restorative sleep, nor the end of torment. It was an internal darkness, a damp, suffocating cave where mirages came alive, more vivid and terrifying than under the scorching sun. The ground beneath him was not sand, but a bed of burning embers, and the air, dense and heavy, seemed to crush his lungs. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his parched throat. His voice was merely a whisper in the storm of his own mind, an inaudible lament lost in the void. The shadowy figures that once danced at the edges of his vision now surrounded him, distorted faces of people he had hurt, of broken promises, of his own grandmother, whose blind but piercing gaze seemed to bore into his soul. The albino lion, once a phantom on the horizon, was now an imposing presence, its golden eyes gleaming in the darkness, watching him with deadly patience. There was no anger in the creature's gaze, only the cold, relentless certainty of a predator awaiting the right moment, nature's scales tipping inexorably to one side. As the grandson struggled in his private hell, the grandmother felt the afternoon breeze begin to blow, a softer breath than the desert's midday exhalation. The sun, now an orange-red sphere, slowly slid westward, painting the dunes with hues of fire and shadow. The oppressive heat began to recede, giving way to a gradual coolness, but the grandmother knew that the desert night brought its own set of challenges. The lion, her silent guardian, adjusted itself again, its soft, warm body offering a shield against the wind that was beginning to gain strength. She felt the gentle tremor of its purr, a sound that resonated in her chest and brought a deep peace. "Night is coming, my friend," she whispered, her voice weak but firm. And with it, the cold. The temperature continued to drop rapidly, and the air, once a furnace, now carried a biting dampness that penetrated her bones. The grandson, still in his stupor, began to tremble uncontrollably. The fever that had consumed him now mingled with a deep chill. His body, exhausted and dehydrated, could not regulate its own temperature. The mirages of fire and distorted faces gave way to visions of ice and snow, of white mountains and frozen rivers. He saw himself sinking into an icy lake, water flooding his lungs, the cold paralyzing his limbs. It was a different torment, but equally excruciating. He coughed, a dry, painful cough that tore at his throat. The sound, muffled by the sand, was almost inaudible, but the lion heard it. Its golden eyes turned to the shrunken figure, a dark spot in the vast expanse of the desert. The creature did not move, did not make a sound. It merely watched, a silent and relentless judge. The lion was not a savior, nor an executioner driven by revenge. It was the manifestation of natural law, the scale that weighed actions and their consequences. And the grandson, with his cruelty and selfishness, had tipped that scale against himself. The grandmother, feeling the cold intensify, pressed herself closer to the lion's warm body. She thought of the medicines, the illness, the need that led her to ask for help. She thought of her grandson's coldness, the way he discarded her like a useless object. But there was no bitterness in her heart, only a serene acceptance of fate and immense gratitude for that white-furred angel that protected her. Life, she knew, was a cycle of giving and receiving, of sowing and reaping. And the grandson was reaping what he had sown, not by her hand, but by the hand of the desert itself. The wind howled now, kicking up clouds of fine sand that whipped through the air. Visibility decreased, and night became a thick curtain, punctuated only by the stars that began to emerge, bright and indifferent. The grandson, in his delirium, felt himself float, his body light and weightless. The pain, for a brief moment, lessened, replaced by a strange sense of peace. He was dying, he knew, and strangely, the idea no longer terrified him as much as thirst or heat. It was an end, a relief. But then, a new sound. Not the howl of the wind, nor the rustle of the sand. It was a low, deep growl that seemed to come from within the earth itself. It was not the albino lion. It was something more, something the desert hid in its shadows, something the night brought forth. The growl repeated, closer, more threatening. The peace shattered, replaced by a renewed and chilling terror. He tried to open his eyes, but his eyelids were heavy, glued shut. He was blind in the darkness, at the mercy of any creature the desert might send to claim its debt. The albino lion, a few meters away, raised its head, its golden eyes fixed in the direction of the sound. Its tail whipped the sand once in a gesture of alert. Night had fallen, and with it, the true predators of the desert. The growl repeated, closer, more threatening. It was not the deep, guttural sound of the albino lion, which, despite being imposing, carried a strange dignity. This new sound was harsh, ragged, almost a guttural laugh that chilled the soul. It was the sound of hunger, of opportunity, of pointless cruelty. The grandson, in his feverish stupor, felt the air thicken, not with the weight of heat, but with a palpable presence, a smell of flesh and earth, of something wild and unclean. Panic, which seemed to have reached its peak, found new depths to explore. He tried to move, tried to scream, but his muscles were paralyzed by the cold and terror. His mouth was so dry it felt cemented. The darkness around him was no longer just the absence of light. It was a veil that hid monsters, a stage for his end. He heard the dragging of paws in the sand, not one, but several. The growl multiplied, forming a dissonant chorus that echoed in his mind, each note a nail in his coffin. They were hyenas, he realized, or perhaps jackals, the scavengers of the desert, drawn by the smell of weakness, by the premonition of death. The mirages, once visions of fire and ice, now transformed into gleaming eyes in the darkness, pairs and pairs of yellowish orbs that watched him from all sides. He felt the warm, foul breath of one of them near his face, the sound of teeth clacking, the rustle of coarse fur. He was surrounded. The momentary peace that the idea of death had brought shattered, replaced by a visceral, terrifying dread. He did not want to die like this, torn apart in the darkness, his flesh devoured by unclean creatures. A few meters away, the albino lion maintained its posture, majestic and still. Its golden eyes, previously fixed in the direction of the sound, now swept the perimeter, assessing the threat. The hyenas, or whatever they were numerous but cautious. They sensed the presence of the great feline, the alpha predator, and kept a respectful distance, though their hunger urged them closer to the fallen man. The lion did not growl, did not move to attack. Its tail, however, swayed slowly, a white pendulum against the dark sand, a sign of its unwavering vigilance. The grandmother, nestled against the lion's warm body, felt the change in the air. The feline's soft purr had ceased. She felt the tension in its muscles, the way it had become a statue of pure strength. She heard the distant sounds, the growls and the dragging in the sand, and though she could not see, her blind mind painted a vivid picture of what was happening. She knew the grandson was in danger, a different danger from the heat and thirst, a danger that the night brought forth. But she felt no pity, only a distant sadness, the sadness of seeing a life unfold into its own ruin. The lion was her guardian, not the grandson's executioner. It had fulfilled its part of justice, freeing her and disabling the jeep. What happened now was the desert collecting its own debt, a debt that could not be paid with money nor with pleas for forgiveness. It was the relentless law of nature. The grandson felt a tug on his leg, a strong, painful tug that made him gasp. He tried to kick, but his limbs were heavy and powerless. Another tug, stronger. He felt his skin tear, the pain sharp, but strangely distant, as if his body no longer belonged to him. He was being dragged, slowly, inexorably, away from the relative safety of the jeep, into the darkness, where the gleaming eyes waited. He heard the albino lion emit a low growl, a sound not of anger but of warning. The hyenas hesitated for a moment, retreating a few steps, their growls diminishing to whispers. They knew the lion was not a threat to them unless they got too close to its prey, the grandmother. The grandson, however, was not its concern. He was an easy meal, a gift from the desert. The lion turned its head slightly, its golden eyes fixed on the grandson being dragged away. There was a strange melancholy in its gaze, or perhaps just the cold indifference of nature. It would not intervene. The sentence had been passed. The desert was merely executing it. The grandmother felt the lion's body relax a little, though its vigilance remained. She knew it was watching, but not acting. She pressed her hand into its soft fur, feeling the strength and warmth that protected her. The wind howled louder now, muffling the distant sounds of the grandson's torment, mixing them with the lament of the desert. The grandson, as he was dragged into the darkness, felt the intense cold of the sand beneath his body, the biting air that invaded his lungs. The stars, which had once seemed indifferent, now shone with a cruel intensity, silent witnesses to his end. He remembered his grandmother, her blind gaze, her plea for help. The image of her face, once distorted by hatred, now seemed clear, serene, almost forgiving. A dry tear rolled down his cracked face, a last drop of humanity amidst the despair. He felt more tugs, more bites. The pain intensified, but his mind was shutting down. The sounds became muffled, the visions blurred. The desert, with its ancient and relentless laws, was finally claiming its debt. The albino lion, a white phantom in the darkness, remained by the grandmother's side, a silent guardian as the night swallowed the last vestiges of human cruelty. Life and death, justice and consequence unfolded under the vast and indifferent desert sky. The tug on the grandson's leg was no longer an isolated incident, but the beginning of a methodical torment. He felt the rough sand scratch his back as he was dragged, not in a straight line, but in a zigzag, like a broken toy being pulled by a group of cruel children. The growls, once distant, were now a deafening chorus, a hymn to his misfortune. He felt more bites, not just on his leg, but on his arms, on his torso, each one an electric shock of pain that coursed through his already exhausted body. Skin tore, muscles contracted, but the strength to resist had long since vanished. He was merely flesh, a walking feast for the predators of the night. His mind, already fragile from fever and dehydration, began to fragment. Visions of ice and snow mingled with flashes of a not-so-distant past. He saw his grandmother's face, not the aged, blind face he had abandoned, but a younger, smiling face, holding his hand when he was a child. The image was so vivid that for an instant the physical pain lessened, replaced by a pang of something he did not recognize: regret. It was a strange, heavy feeling that oppressed him more than the bites. The gleaming eyes in the darkness multiplied, forming a tight circle around him. He could feel the warm, foul breath up close, the smell of raw meat and earth. The sound of clacking teeth was constant, a macabre rhythm for his last dance. He tried to scream, tried to beg, but his throat was dry, his voice no more than a hoarse whisper lost in the howl of the wind. The desert, with its monumental indifference, heard no pleas. A few meters away, the albino lion maintained its posture, a white statue against the darkness. Its golden eyes followed the grandson's movement, a dark spot being dragged to the periphery of its vision. It would not intervene. Its mission was to protect the innocent, not to save the guilty. The law of the desert was clear. Every action had its consequence, and the grandson was reaping the bitterest of harvests. The low growl the lion had emitted earlier was not of anger, but of a warning, a demarcation of territory. The grandmother was its responsibility. The grandson was not. The grandmother, nestled against the lion's warm body, felt the subtle tremor in the feline's muscles, the tension that ran through its powerful frame. She heard the distant sounds, the growls and the dragging in the sand, which now seemed to recede, diminishing in intensity. Her blind mind painted a vivid picture of what was happening, not with her eyes, but with her soul. She knew the grandson was being taken, that the desert was collecting its debt. There was no triumph in her heart, no joy in revenge, only a deep sadness, the sadness of seeing a life unfold into its own ruin. She pressed her hand into its soft fur, feeling the strength and warmth that protected her. The lion, in response, emitted a low purr, a sound that vibrated through her body, a balm for her soul. It was a sound of comfort, of security, a brutal contrast to the sounds of terror receding into the night. The grandmother thought of the medicines, the illness, the need that led her to ask for help. She thought of her grandson's coldness, the way he discarded her like a useless object, but there was no bitterness in her heart, only a serene acceptance of fate and immense gratitude for that white-furred angel that protected her. The grandson, as he was dragged into the increasing darkness, felt the intense cold of the sand beneath his body, the biting air that invaded his lungs. The stars, which had once seemed indifferent, now shone with a cruel intensity, silent witnesses to his end. The pain intensified, but his mind was shutting down, like a candle slowly extinguishing. The sounds became muffled, the visions blurred. He felt one last strong tug, a searing pain that made him gasp, and then a void. In his last moments of consciousness, a clear image emerged in his mind. His grandmother, not the young, smiling face, but the aged, blind face, with an expression of serene dignity, almost forgiving. A dry tear rolled down his cracked face, a last drop of humanity amidst the despair. He did not want to die like this, torn apart in the darkness, his flesh devoured by unclean creatures. But the wish now was useless. The desert, with its ancient and relentless laws, was finally claiming its debt. The albino lion, a white phantom in the darkness, remained by the grandmother's side, a silent guardian. Its golden eyes now reflected only the vastness of the stars, without any trace of the human drama unfolding a few meters away. The night swallowed the last vestiges of human cruelty, and the wind howled, carrying with it the echoes of a deserved end. Life and death, justice and consequence, unfolded under the vast and indifferent desert sky, which, like the lion, merely observed without judgment, without pity, only the law. The grandmother, feeling the lion's warmth and the soft purr, closed her eyes, surrendering to the peace of the night, while the desert performed its cleansing. The cycle of nature had completed itself. The grandson's last scream was not a sound, but an absence, a sudden vacuum in the chorus of growls and snaps that echoed in the darkness. The grandmother, nestled against the lion's warm body, felt the change. The tremor in the feline's muscles subsided. The tension that ran through it slowly dissipated, like smoke from a dying fire. The silence that followed was not absolute, but a different silence, filled only by the incessant howl of the wind and the whisper of sand dancing over the dunes. The sounds of torment had ceased, replaced by a somber quietude, the quietude that settles after the conclusion of a final act. She pressed her hand into the lion's soft fur, feeling the vibration of a low, deep purr that began to resonate in its chest. It was not a purr of satisfaction, but of a return to normalcy, to its wild and protective nature. The albino lion, a white spectre in the night, remained motionless, its golden eyes fixed in the direction where the grandson had been dragged. There was no triumph in its gaze, nor compassion, only the cold, impartial observation of nature which had allowed the desert's justice to take its course. The grandmother felt the weight of the night upon her, the biting cold that precedes dawn, but the lion's warmth was a shield against the relentless desert temperature. In her blind mind, she visualized what had happened, not with horror, but with a deep resignation. The desert had collected its debt, and the grandson, in his arrogance and cruelty, had paid the highest price. There was no room for joy or revenge in her heart, only a persistent sadness, the sadness of a wasted life, of a chosen path that led to ruin. Hours dragged on, marked only by the subtle change in air temperature and the movement of the stars in the sky. The lion remained by her side, a constant and comforting presence. She could smell the sand, the wind, and a faint aroma of flesh and blood that the wind carried from afar, a somber reminder of what the night had witnessed. But the lion protected her, not only physically, but also from any trace of fear or despair. It was her sanctuary amidst the hostile vastness. A pale glow began to emerge on the eastern horizon. Darkness slowly receded, revealing the soft silhouettes of the dunes, which had previously been indistinct shadows. The sky, from a deep black, began to be tinged with shades of purple, pink, and orange, announcing the arrival of the sun. The albino lion, which until then had seemed like a statue, moved. It rose with silent grace, stretching its powerful muscles. The grandmother felt the movement, the momentary loss of warmth, and a pang of apprehension. What would happen now? The lion turned to her, and she felt its soft muzzle brush her hand. It was a gentle touch, a silent invitation. She understood. It was time to move on. With an effort she stood up, her limbs stiff and sore. But her mind was clear. Thirst still tormented her, and hunger was a constant pang, but the lion's presence filled her with renewed strength. She placed her hand on its flank, feeling the firmness of its body, and it began to walk slowly, with measured steps, guiding her away from the place where the tragedy had unfolded. The sun emerged on the horizon, a disk of fire that painted the desert with golden and reddish hues. The dunes, once mysterious in the darkness, now revealed their undulating forms, infinite and imposing. The heat began to intensify almost immediately, promising another day of torment under the 50-degree sun. But the grandmother was not alone. The albino lion was her compass, her guide, her protector. It walked ahead, but always close enough for her to feel its presence, for her hand to touch its fur. The journey was arduous. The soft sand sank beneath her feet, making each step a monumental effort. The wind, which had once been a distant howl, now kicked up clouds of fine sand that whipped her face and infiltrated her clothes. Her blind eyes could not see the path, but her other senses were sharpened. She heard the soft sound of the lion's paws in the sand, felt the sun's warmth on her skin, the dry, mineral smell of the desert. And above all, she felt the unwavering presence of the lion, an anchor amidst the desolate vastness. She did not know where they were going, nor why the lion was guiding her. But there was no questioning in her heart. There was only trust. This lion, this white-furred angel, had been sent to her in her moment of greatest despair. It had cut her bonds, disabled her tormentor, and protected her from the dangers of the night. Now it guided her to an unknown destination, but she knew it was the path she was meant to follow. With each step, the grandson's jeep, now just a distant speck on the horizon, diminished in size, becoming an insignificant dot in the landscape. With it, the last vestige of the cruelty that had bound her also diminished. The desert, with its brutal beauty and monumental indifference, was cleansing itself, purifying the land of traces of human evil. The grandmother, guided by the lion, was becoming part of this cycle, a silent witness to nature's relentless law. The tension had not disappeared, but it had transformed. It was the tension of survival, of uncertainty, of the journey in a wild world. But it was a tension tempered by hope, by gratitude, and by the strange peace that only acceptance of fate can bring. The sun climbed higher, and their journey had only just begun. The sun, a disk of fire in the relentless sky, climbed rapidly, transforming the desert into an incandescent furnace. With each step, the grandmother felt the sand burn through the thin soles of her shoes, a constant pain that added to the unbearable thirst and the hunger gnawing at her insides. The albino lion, a white spectre against the scorching gold of the dunes, maintained a steady rhythm, its strides long and silent, a rhythmic melody that the grandmother used to keep her own stumbling pace. She did not know how long they had walked. The hours blended into an eternity of heat, sand, and effort. Her lips were cracked, her throat dry and rough as sandpaper. With each breath, the hot, heavy air seemed to burn her lungs. She could feel sweat trickling down her wrinkled face, mixing with the dust to form an irritating paste. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she refused to stop. The lion did not stop, and she trusted it with unwavering faith. Her mind, despite the physical exhaustion, remained strangely lucid. She thought of her life, of the choices that had led her to this point. Poverty, illness, the vain hope that her grandson, the only blood of her blood, might have a shred of compassion. The irony was cruel. It was a wild animal, a desert predator, who showed her true compassion. A lion, a king of beasts, was her savior and guide, while her own grandson had abandoned her to the cruelest death. There was no bitterness, only a serene acceptance of the truth. She felt the warmth emanating from the lion's body, even under the scorching sun. It was a comforting warmth, proof of its constant presence. From time to time, it would slow its pace, and she would feel its soft muzzle lightly brush her hand, a silent reminder that it was there, that it would not abandon her. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes, a universal language of care and protection that transcended the barriers between species. The sound of the wind, once a distant howl, was now a constant roar, kicking up clouds of sand that whipped her face and infiltrated her clothes, covering her with a thin, irritating layer. She coughed, choking on the dust, but continued to drag herself. With each step she imagined water, fresh and crystal clear, flowing down her throat. The vision was so vivid it was almost torturous, a mental mirage in the desert of her mind. Suddenly the lion stopped. The grandmother felt the abrupt interruption of rhythm, and her heart pounded in her chest. A primal fear invaded her, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. What had happened? She pressed her hand into its flank, seeking security in the firmness of its muscles. The lion remained motionless for a long moment, and the grandmother could feel the tension in its muscles, a sharp vigilance that made her hold her breath. Then it emitted a low, almost inaudible growl that vibrated through her body. It was not a growl of aggression, but of alert, a warning. She felt the air change, a different smell, something that was not just sand and heat, a smell of life, but also of danger, a wild odor that the wind carried from somewhere. The lion began to move again, but differently. Its steps were more cautious, slower, and it seemed to guide the grandmother to one side, swerving away from something invisible. She tried to concentrate, sharpening her other senses. The sound of the wind seemed to carry other sounds now, something like a distant rustle, a movement in the sand that was not the lion's. Her blind eyes could not see, but her imagination painted images of crawling creatures, of smaller predators hiding under the sun, waiting for an opportunity. The desert was relentless, and the grandmother knew that it was not just the heat that could kill. The lion led her along a winding path, and the grandmother felt the sand change beneath her feet, becoming rockier in some places, softer in others. It was guiding her with an instinctive precision, avoiding dangers she could not perceive, but that it felt with every fiber of its being. The trust she placed in it was absolute. It was her eyes, her ears, her strength. After what seemed like an eternity, the lion stopped again. This time, the growl dissipated, and the tension in its body lessened. The grandmother felt a change in the terrain. They were on higher ground, and the wind seemed stronger here, but it also brought a subtle coolness. She could feel the presence of something large and solid in front of her, a rocky mass that offered partial shade, an unexpected refuge. The lion guided her into the shade, and the grandmother felt the immediate relief from the scorching sun. It was a small but precious shade, offered by an imposing rock formation, a sleeping giant in the middle of the desert. She let herself fall onto the sand, exhausted but grateful. The lion lay down beside her, its body warm and soft, a comfort amidst the harshness of the desert. She could smell the rock heated by the sun, the smell of dust, and once again, the clean, wild smell of the lion. Her ears caught the sound of the wind howling through the rock crevices, creating a strange and melancholic melody. Thirst still tormented her, but the pause, the shade, and the lion's presence were a balm for her tired soul. She knew the journey was far from over. The desert was vast and merciless, but with the lion by her side, she felt a faint hope. It had saved her, had guided her. Perhaps it was leading her to a place where she could find not only water and food, but also a new beginning, a place where human cruelty could not reach her. The lion, in its majestic silence, seemed to observe the horizon, its golden eyes fixed on something the grandmother could not see. It was the personification of the desert's strength and resilience, and she, a fragile, blind old woman, was its protected one. Together, they were an unlikely image of survival, a testament to the strange and beautiful dance of life in the heart of a wild and untamed world. The tension of survival remained, but now it was accompanied by a quietude, an acceptance of the path ahead, no matter how difficult it was. The desert, with its secrets and dangers, still had much to reveal, and the grandmother was ready to face whatever came, guided by her white-furred angel. The rock crevice was a precarious but vital refuge. Outside, the desert howled, a deafening symphony of sand and wind that seemed to want to tear the very fabric of reality. Inside, however, the fury was muffled, transformed into a distant roar that vibrated through the rock and the lion's body. The grandmother, huddled against her protector, felt every tremor, every breath of sand-laden air that managed to seep through the cracks. The smell of damp, fresh rock, mixed with the wild, clean aroma of the lion, was a constant reminder of her improbable safety. Thirst was a burning ember in her throat, and hunger, a dull ache that intensified with each passing minute. Her lips were cracked, her tongue rough. Every breath was an effort, the hot, dry air burning her lungs. She tried to focus on the present, on the small portion of shelter, on the lion's safety. But her mind insisted on wandering, on imagining water, cold and clear, flowing down her throat, an almost unbearable torment. Time seemed to stretch and shrink at the same time. She did not know how long she had been there, in the tense quietude of that rocky refuge. The lion, her silent guardian, remained motionless, its body a living barrier against the storm. She could feel the tension in its muscles even at rest, the readiness of a predator who, for some inexplicable reason, had chosen to protect her. The trust she placed in it was the only thing that kept her sane. It had saved her, had guided her, and she believed it would continue to do so. Gradually, the roar of the wind began to diminish. The deafening fury gave way to a softer howl, then to a distant murmur. The vibration in the rock subsided. The grandmother felt the change in the air, which became less dense, less laden with sand. The smell of dust was still strong, but no longer suffocating. The lion, which had been in a state of constant alert, moved. She felt its body stretch. A silent yawn, and then it stood up, majestic and imposing. Its soft muzzle touched her shoulder, an invitation, a sign that it was time to move on. The grandmother, with immense effort, stood up, feeling the sand fall from her clothes and hair. Her muscles were stiff, her legs weak, but the urgency in the lion's posture was unmistakable. It guided her out of the crevice, into what she imagined was a transformed world. The air was fresher, cleaner, though still laden with the residue of the storm. The silence that followed the end of the fury was almost as oppressive as the noise. She could hear the sound of her own footsteps in the sand, the rustle of her clothes, the whisper of the wind that was now just a gentle breeze. The smell of the desert was different now, more intense, more raw. The sun, which she could feel on her skin, seemed less intense than before, perhaps because the air was cleaner, or because the dust still lingered, filtering its strongest rays. The lion led her through terrain that seemed to have been sculpted anew by the storm. Dunes that once existed might have been erased, and new ones formed. The sand was softer in some places, more compact in others. She felt the texture beneath her feet, the irregularity of the terrain, the small pebbles that the storm had unearthed. Each step was a constant reminder of the desperate need for water. The grandmother tried to focus on the sensation of the lion by her side, on the firmness of its steps, on the implicit promise that it knew where it was going. But doubt, a treacherous whisper, began to infiltrate her exhausted mind. How much longer could she endure? Where was it taking her? Was there really an oasis, a refuge? Or were they just wandering aimlessly, doomed to succumb to the relentless vastness of the desert? Suddenly the lion stopped. She felt the tension in its body again, a silent alert. It emitted a low, deep growl that reverberated in its chest. It was not a growl of aggression, but of caution, of recognition. The grandmother extended her hand, feeling the air, trying to discern what had stopped her guide. The wind brought a different smell now, an aroma she could not identify, but which seemed to carry a promise, or perhaps a danger. The lion moved again, but this time its steps were slower, more deliberate. It pulled her back to the protection of a small sand elevation. She felt the warmth of the sun on her face, but also a partial shadow offered by the dune. The lion's growl intensified slightly, a sound of vigilance. Then the wind brought a sound, a faint sound at first, but which soon became clearer, more distinct. It was the sound of water, not the gurgle of a stream, nor the drip of a spring, but the unmistakable sound of moving water, perhaps a small lake or a larger puddle. Hope, long dormant, awoke in her chest with an overwhelming force. Warm tears streamed down her parched cheeks. Water. The word was a balm, a promise of life. The lion, perceiving her reaction, pushed her gently forward, its steps more hurried now. The grandmother stumbled, but the vision of water, even if only in her imagination, gave her renewed strength. She clung to the lion, her steps becoming firmer, propelled by the promise the sound brought. The smell of water, of damp vegetation, began to mix with the smell of the desert, a wonderful contrast. They were arriving. She could feel the sand becoming more compact, the air more humid. The sound of water was now a constant murmur, an irresistible invitation. The lion stopped one last time, and the grandmother felt the presence of something large and smooth in front of her. It guided her down, and her feet touched something other than sand. It was damp earth, perhaps mud. Then she heard the lion lower its head and drink. The sound of water being lapped was the sweetest music she had ever heard. She knelt, feeling the ground, and her fingers found the edge of a puddle of water. It was fresh, clear. Without hesitation, she dipped her hands and brought the water to her cracked lips. The first sip was a shock, an explosion of life that coursed through her entire body. She drank and drank, feeling the thirst diminish, the pain in her throat calm. Never before had water tasted so divine, so essential. The lion, satisfied, lay down beside her, watching her in silence. The grandmother felt the relief, the gratitude. They had found water. It was not an exuberant oasis, but a puddle, a gift from the desert after the storm, perhaps a depression that had collected the little rain. It was enough. For now, it was all that mattered. Life once again had found a way, and the lion, her albino angel, had been the guide. There was still hunger, a persistent pang that reminded her of the fragility of her existence. But with thirst quenched, a new mental clarity settled in. She could think, could feel hope blossom in her chest. The desert was relentless, yes, but it also offered miracles. And the greatest of them was there by her side, a lion that protected and guided her. The sun began to set, tinging the sky she could not see with shades of orange and purple, which she could only imagine. The night air brought a welcome coolness, but also the promise of the desert's biting cold. The grandmother knew the journey was far from over, that each day would bring new challenges. But for this night, she had water, shelter, and the silent company of her savior, and that, in the heart of the desert, was more than enough. It was life. The first sip of water had been a blessing, but thirst, though quenched, was not the desert's only tyrant. Hunger, a dull and persistent ache, soon resurfaced, sharper now that her body was no longer so desperately focused on the lack of hydration. The grandmother felt her empty stomach contract, a constant reminder of the fragility of her existence. She was alive, yes, but life in the desert demanded more than just water. It demanded sustenance, and she had no idea where to find it. The lion, her silent guardian, lay beside her, its deep, steady breathing a comforting sound in the growing quietude of dusk. The sun, which she could not see, was setting, and the air, once scorching, began to give way to a coolness that promised the biting cold of the desert night. She felt the ground, sensing the damp earth beneath her fingers. a welcome contrast to the dry, scorching sand from before. The puddle of water was small but precious, a mirror of life in the midst of the arid vastness. The smell of water and damp earth was a balm to her senses, but it soon mingled with the wild aroma of the lion and the pungent smell of the desert night, which brought with it the promise of hidden creatures. She heard the distant rustle of something in the sand, the melancholic call of a nocturnal animal, the whisper of the wind that now seemed to carry secrets. Every sound was amplified by the darkness and her blindness, transforming the environment into a tapestry of dangers and mysteries. The grandmother huddled closer to the lion, seeking not only the warmth of its body, but the security of its presence. She knew it was a predator, but to her it was a protector. A strange symbiosis had formed between the blind old woman and the majestic albino feline, an improbable alliance forged in human cruelty and nature's relentlessness. Hunger, however, could not be ignored. She tried to remember some edible plant that might grow near a water source, but her memory, blurred by exhaustion and trauma, offered no answers. Her lips were still cracked, but her throat no longer burned. Energy, however, was low. She needed something to eat, and soon. Suddenly, the lion moved. A low, guttural growl escaped its throat, a sound of warning that made the grandmother's heart pound. She extended her hand, feeling the air, trying to understand what had disturbed her guardian. The lion stood up, its body tense, and she felt the vibration of its muscles as it moved. It did not leave her, however. It positioned itself between her and the invisible danger, a living wall of strength and vigilance. She heard footsteps in the sand, heavier than those of a small rodent, slower than those of a lizard. A different smell, a wild and strange aroma reached her, mixing with the familiar smell of the desert. It was the smell of another predator, perhaps, or of a curious creature attracted by the water. The lion growled again, louder this time, a clear and unmistakable warning. The footsteps ceased, the smell receded. Silence returned, heavier than before, laden with a palpable tension. The lion remained on guard for a long time, until gradually its body relaxed. It lay down again, but this time its head was raised, its senses sharp, always vigilant. The grandmother felt a shiver run down her spine. The desert did not sleep, and neither could she. Hours dragged on, marked only by the intensification of the cold and the sporadic sounds of the night. She thought of her grandson, of his cruelty, of the irony of being abandoned to die and saved by a beast. Anger, a feeling she rarely allowed herself, bubbled in her chest. But it was an impotent anger, quickly replaced by the pressing need to survive. She remembered a small plant her mother used to gather near streams in her youth, a bitter but nutritious herb. Could something similar grow here? With a clearer mind, she began to feel around the puddle, careful not to stray too far from the lion. Her fingers explored the damp earth, feeling the texture of small stones, of thin roots. Nothing, only earth and sand. Frustration began to set in, but then her fingers touched something different. A leaf, small and fleshy, with a slightly sticky texture. She followed the stem, finding other leaves, a small cluster of life stubbornly clinging to the edge of the puddle. It was a low, almost creeping plant. She plucked a leaf and brought it to her nose. The smell was faint, earthy, without the strong aroma of poison. With hesitation, she bit off a small piece. It was bitter, yes, but not unpleasant. And most importantly, it did not seem to cause any adverse reaction. With a sigh of relief, the grandmother began to gather the small leaves, eating them slowly, one by one. It was not a hearty meal, but it was something. It was a relief from hunger, a small victory against the desert's relentlessness. The lion, which watched her in silence, emitted a low sound, almost a purr, as if approving her initiative. Night advanced, and the cold became more intense. The grandmother huddled even closer to the lion, feeling the warmth of its body radiate through its thick fur. It was her blanket, her guardian, her only hope. She finally managed to close her eyes, exhausted, but with a new and faint hope. She dreamed of water, of food, of a safe place. When the first ray of sun touched the sand, announcing a new day, the grandmother felt the lion rise. It stretched, and she felt the powerful movement of its muscles. The night's cold still lingered in the air, but the promise of the day's warmth was already palpable. The lion touched her shoulder with its muzzle, a silent invitation to continue. She stood up, feeling the aches of the night, but also a renewed determination. The puddle of water was still there, a reminder of her luck. The small plants had offered temporary relief. The journey was not over, but they had survived the night. And with the lion by her side, she felt she could face anything the desert had in store for them. The lion guided her away from the puddle in a new direction, into the unknown, but towards a future where hope, however fragile, still persisted. The desert stretched ahead, vast and challenging, but now they had a purpose, and the grandmother, with her albino guide, was ready to face it. The sun was rising, an invisible furnace that promised a day of torment. The grandmother felt the heat rapidly increase on her skin, a cruel reminder that the night of relief had ended. The lion, her silent guide, moved with a determination she already trusted. She felt the gentle touch of its muzzle on her shoulder, an invitation to move forward, to abandon the small puddle that had given them a night of truce. With a sigh, she stood up, the aches of age and ordeal pounding in her bones. The sand beneath her feet was softer here, still damp in places, but it would soon return to its scorching nature. The lion led her, step by step, away from that small miracle. To where? She did not know, but the trust she had placed in it was absolute, a blind faith that overcame the fear of the unknown. The journey resumed under the merciless sun. She felt the hot wind whip her face, kicking up grains of sand that scratched her skin. The desert's silence was broken only by the sound of her own shuffling footsteps and the deep, steady breathing of the lion beside her. It was a solid presence, a beacon of strength in her darkness. Hours passed, or perhaps they were just minutes stretching into an eternity of heat and exhaustion. Hunger, though temporarily relieved by the few bitter leaves, returned to gnaw at her stomach. Thirst, though not as desperate as before, was a constant promise of future suffering. She knew the puddle's water would not last forever, and that every drop was precious. Suddenly, the terrain changed. The sand, previously relatively flat, began to slope. She felt her feet sink deeper, and the effort for each step increased. The lion, however, seemed unshakable, its pace steady and powerful. She heard a different sound, a more intense rustle of the wind, but not the wind that whipped the sand. It was a denser sound, as if the air was moving differently. The lion stopped. A low growl escaped its throat, and the grandmother felt the tension in its body. She extended her hand, feeling the air, but there was nothing but emptiness and heat. The desert smell changed, becoming more mineral, drier. And then she heard a distant but unmistakable sound. The roar of the wind, not a whisper but a growing voice, laden with sand. A sandstorm. Terror chilled her blood, even under the scorching sun. She had heard stories, legends of lost travelers swallowed by the desert's fury. She was blind, vulnerable, and now a new threat arose. The lion, however, did not seem frightened. It growled again, a sound of warning, not of fear. It nudged her gently with its muzzle, indicating a direction. She obeyed, trusting its instinct. They began to climb, the soft sand making each step difficult. The wind increased, and now she felt the grains of sand hitting her face, her arms, like thousands of tiny needles. The sound of the storm was deafening, a chorus of howls and whistles that seemed to come from all directions. The lion guided her to what appeared to be a rock formation, a steep outcrop that offered a little protection. She felt the rough surface of the rock beneath her hands, a welcome contrast to the shifting sand. The lion nestled close to her, its body serving as a shield against the fury of the wind and sand. She huddled, covering her face with her arms, feeling the desert try to swallow them. Far away, under the same merciless sun, the grandson cursed the day he was born. The jeep, a symbol of his arrogance, lay useless, its tires shredded like eggshells. The water had run out hours ago. His lips were cracked and swollen, his throat burning. His skin, once tanned, was now red and sore, burned by the 50-degree sun. He staggered, trying to find some shade, some hope. But there was nothing, only dunes and more dunes, a sea of sand that stretched as far as the eye could see. The anger he felt towards his grandmother and the lion had transformed into a chilling despair. He was alone, abandoned, and the irony of his fate was an even more bitter poison than thirst. He fell to his knees, his head throbbing, the world spinning, his vision blurred, and the heat seemed to crush him. He screamed, but his voice was only a hoarse whisper, swallowed by the relentless silence of the desert. Back at the rock, the grandmother felt the storm gradually subside. The wind still blew strong, but the fine sand rain was ceasing. The lion, which had remained motionless by her side, raised its head, sniffing the air. It nudged her again, indicating it was time to move. When she stood up, she felt a change in the air, an unexpected coolness. The smell of sand was still present, but there was something more, a subtle aroma she could not identify. The lion guided her to what appeared to be the other side of the rock formation. The terrain sloped gently, and the air seemed calmer here. Then her feet touched something different. It was not sand nor rock. It was a smooth, cold surface. She knelt, feeling it. It was stone, but a stone that seemed to have been worked, polished by time and wind. Her fingers explored the surface, feeling grooves and elevations. They were symbols, shapes she did not recognize, but which seemed ancient, forgotten. The lion emitted a low sound, almost a moan, and she felt its body tense. It guided her a little further ahead, and the smell intensified. It was a smell of ancient earth, of something that had been hidden for centuries, and then she felt a fresher airflow coming from below. There was an opening, a crack in the rock, or perhaps an entrance. The lion pushed her gently forward, indicating she should enter. Fear invaded her. What could be inside? Wild animals, snakes? But her trust in the lion was greater than her fear. It would not lead her to death. With hesitation, she crawled into the opening. The air inside was fresh and damp, a welcome relief from the suffocating desert heat. The smell of earth and stone was strong, and she heard the echo of her own breathing. The lion followed her, its large body barely fitting through the narrow passage. They were in a cave, an unexpected refuge, a sanctuary in the heart of hell. She felt the walls, sensing the cold, damp rock. The lion lay down beside her, its deep, comforting breath filling the small space. The grandmother felt immense relief. They had survived the storm, and now they had shelter. But the cave was not just a shelter. There was something more, a distant sound, a constant dripping, water, and the smell, now stronger, of life. She extended her hand, and her fingers touched something soft, like moss. And then, further ahead, she felt the air move differently, as if the cave opened into a larger space. The lion stood up and guided her deeper into what seemed to be the heart of the mountain. The journey was far from over, but the desert in its cruelty had offered them a new miracle. The lion guided her deeper, into what seemed to be the heart of the mountain. The air, initially just cool, became wonderfully cold, and the smell of damp earth and moss intensified, mingling with a sweet, earthy aroma that the grandmother could not identify. Her feet now trod on a softer surface, not the soft sand of the desert, but something like compacted soil covered by a thin, damp layer. The sound of constant dripping water became more present, a soft, hypnotizing rhythm that promised life. Then the lion stopped. The grandmother felt its massive body settle beside her, and a low growl, almost a purr of satisfaction, vibrated in its chest. She extended her hand, feeling the space ahead. Her fingers touched a rock wall, but not the rough, irregular rock of the entrance. This was smooth, almost polished, and covered with a layer of cold moisture. She moved her hand down and felt water, not a drip, but a small stream, a gentle current that flowed over the rock and disappeared somewhere below. It was clean, fresh water, a balm for her dry throat. She knelt, bending down to drink. The taste was pure, mineral, the essence of life. Each sip was a blessing, washing away the dust and thirst of days. The lion, with surprising delicacy for its size, lapped water from the rock beside her, its eyes, which she could not see, likely fixed in the darkness. The grandmother drank until her stomach felt satisfied, a feeling of fullness she had not experienced in a long time. But the cave offered more than water. The lion nudged her gently, and she felt the floor descend slightly, leading them into an even larger space. The sweet smell grew stronger, and she realized it was not just moss. Her fingers touched something different on the ground, something with a leafy texture but fleshier. She felt further and found small stems, as if she were in an underground garden. There were plants growing in the darkness, nourished by the constant moisture. She plucked a leaf, bringing it to her nose. The smell was fresh, and upon tasting it, she felt a mild bitterness, but also an unexpected sweetness. It was not the same bitter plant she had found by the puddle, but something different, something that seemed edible. The lion emitted a low sound, and she understood. There was food here, a small oasis hidden in the depths of the earth. They had found a sanctuary. She sat, leaning against the cold rock, feeling relief wash over her body. The lion lay near her, its warmth comforting. The darkness was total, but it was not the oppressive darkness of the desert. It was a welcoming darkness, filled with the soft sounds of water and the lion's breathing. Her fingers continued to explore the cave walls. She found the same marks she had felt at the entrance, the grooves and elevations that formed ancient symbols. This time, with more time and calm, she traced them with her fingers, trying to decipher their meanings. They were shapes that looked like animals, stylized human figures, and complex geometric patterns. They were stories carved into the stone, echoes of a forgotten civilization that had found refuge in this very place. The cave was not just a shelter, it was a testament, a portal to the past. Meanwhile, under the merciless sun that gave no quarter, the grandson staggered. His mind was a whirlwind of distorted images of thirst and pain. The desert was no longer a place. It was a living entity, laughing at his misery. The sand transformed into demonic faces, the cacti into skeletal arms that tried to grab him. He saw his grandmother, not as the helpless old woman he had abandoned, but as an imposing figure, her blind eyes fixed on him, accusing, judging. He fell for the last time, his body exhausted, his throat raw. The heat was unbearable, cooking him from within. He tried to scream, but only a dry hiss escaped his cracked lips, the image of the albino lion, which he had seen before as a hallucination, now materialized again. But this time, it was not still. It was approaching, slow, majestic, its red eyes glowing with a supernatural intensity. The grandson tried to crawl, but his legs did not respond. Terror paralyzed him. He had mocked the old woman, had stolen from her, had left her to die, And now the desert, with its silent guardian, was collecting the price. The lion stopped a few meters from him, not with the intention of attacking, but to witness, to be the herald of desert justice. The grandson closed his eyes, but the images of his cruelty did not leave him. His grandmother tied to the trunk, her weak voice begging for help. The money he had stolen for his vices, the medicines she never received, everything surfaced, not as remorse, but as irrefutable proof of his own condemnation. He felt the sun burn his skin, the wind kick up the sand and throw it in his face, as if the desert itself was burying him alive. The last thing he heard was the sound of the wind, which in his dying ears seemed to whisper his grandmother's name, repeating it endlessly, like a lament or perhaps a final judgment. And then silence. The desert, vast and indifferent, claimed its prey, erasing his existence as if he had never been there. In the hidden oasis, the grandmother felt the sun rise, not the scorching desert sun, but a soft, welcoming warmth that kissed her skin. She could feel the light, even without seeing it, an energy that filled her. The lion guided her to a place where the air was even fresher, and she felt a waterfall, its waters cascading into a serene lake. She could hear the sound of life, the hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, the constant singing of birds. This was the place, the sanctuary. The lion, her faithful guardian, had fulfilled its mission. It had saved her, had guided her through darkness and death to a new dawn. She extended her hand and touched the lion's soft mane, feeling the strength and loyalty in its body. It had been her guide, her protector, her miracle. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The grandmother learned to live in this paradise. With the lion's help, she explored the surroundings, feeling the abundance of fruits and vegetables that grew in profusion. She learned to recognize the sounds of the friendly animals that inhabited the oasis, to feel her way along the winding paths. Her blindness, once a curse, became a blessing, sharpening her other senses, allowing her to experience the world in a way that sighted people rarely could. She spent hours sitting by the lake, listening to the water, feeling the sun on her skin, the wind in her hair. The lion was always nearby, a constant presence, a silent reminder of the justice that had been served and the grace that had been granted to her. She no longer felt the pain of the past, the betrayal of her grandson. That world, with its cruelties and its greed, had been left behind, swallowed by sand and time. Here, in this secret sanctuary, she found peace, she found purpose. She was the guardian of memory, the last witness to a place the world had forgotten. And the lion, her loyal companion, was the guardian of life, the link between past and present, between the desert and paradise. Together they lived, a story of redemption and unconditional love, a testament that even in the deepest darkness, life always finds a way, and justice, however slow, always prevails. The desert, in its relentless vastness, had shown its cruelest face, but also in its secret heart had revealed its most beautiful miracle. And the grandmother, blind but now truly seeing, lived her days in an eternal dawn.